Hello, everyone. My name is John Battsek. I run Ventureland, an independent production company in the UK and US, and I am a producer of feature documentaries. It's my great pleasure to be here hosting this question and answer session with Daniel Roher and Christo Grozev from the director and the subject, or one of the subjects of the utterly brilliant feature documentary Navalny, which I was lucky enough to see quite a long time ago and has stayed with me ever since. Gentlemen, it's a real pleasure and a thrill to be here. Congratulations to you both.
Thanks so much, Sean.
Thanks for having us.
Um, I should start by saying Diane Becker, who is one of, if not she's one of your, and an absolutely brilliant producer. I owe a lot of my success, such as it is, to her, and I'm so delighted that that she's the producer of this brilliant and very important film. So that's thrilling. So let's start, shall we? Obvious question, I suppose, Daniel. What was the origin of this project for you? How did it all come about? Yeah, I'm interested to know how you started down the road.
Well, John, Christo and I, and one of the film's other producers, Odessa Ray, we're actually working on a completely different project. In October of 2020, we found ourselves in Kiev. We were working on a film that had to do with corruption in the president's office in Ukraine. And that film was going nowhere fast. We were hitting a couple of dead ends, and we soon found ourselves in Vienna, in Austria, sort of figuring out what we were going to do next. I was wondering if I was going to go back to Canada, where I'm from, or if there was a film to make, if we go back to Ukraine. We didn't quite know what the situation was. And that's when Christo walked in one morning. We were having a meeting, and he uttered this magic phrase. He said, "I think I have a lead into who tried to poison Navalny." And of all the people in the world who could possibly say that, Christo may be the only one who could say it with any realism. This is the guy who solved or cracked the 2018 Skripal case in the UK, exposing the identities of the agents dispatched to go and murder Sergei Skripal. And so when Christo reached out to Navalny understood that this guy was serious and offered him a meeting. And it just so happened that Navalny and his staff had also been contemplating or thinking about a documentary project. This is a medium they'd never explored before. So, John, it's totally the case of right time, right place. And a week and a half after we had that first discussion, we were invited to go and sit with Navalny and meet with him and essentially pitch him on why we should do a film.
And Christo, from your perspective, do you have any idea what the process might entail and what it might take in order to make a movie like this?
Well, I had spent several months already with Daniel and Odessa working on the other film project, and that was kind of my baptism of fire, my indoctrination into documentary filmmaking. When I was a kid, I really wanted to be in the movies, but never thought that I would be in a documentary filmmaking process. So I had an idea. I also saw how dejected Daniel is because that film had kind of been suspended for a while for reasons that we couldn't control. So I was trying to offer him some face-saving filler idea, and then it turned out to be the Navalny film, which is crazy because I really didn't expect that it would go so far. At the beginning, we had a clue that we may have something breaking in terms of the investigation, but I had no idea we will end up, in fact, in the course of filmmaking, talking to one of the self-confessed poisoners, and that blew my mind. And I thought, okay, well, if this is documentary filmmaking, I want to be part of it in the future as well.
Great. And maybe it's an obvious thing to say, he's such a remarkable, charismatic, sort of magnetic character, and incredibly attractive and appealing and articulate. How are you able to negotiate such amazing access? The film is so intimate with him. What were the sort of what did that process look like? What was he sort of immediately totally open? Did they have any restrictions? What was that like, Daniel?
Well, it's a great question. I remember when we first met, there was sort of this conflict between Navalny's natural enthusiasm for film and documentary making and having us around, but his necessary hesitation and apprehension and skepticism. There was a security requirement to be skeptical of us, and so I like to think that he was enthusiastic right out of the gate. You could tell that was clear, but he had to proceed with caution by virtue of who he was and his situation. And so the filming started almost immediately, but you could tell that Navalny and his staff were very apprehensive. Access was limited, certain meetings, certain things we could film. And then slowly over time, I think just the gesture of putting everything in our lives aside and shooting and beginning to shoot this film immediately was very compelling for Alexei and his team. And certainly by the time we got to the phone call, that one scene in the film, John, where Alexei calls the men on his poison squad and bamboozles one of them into divulging the whole plot. Once we shot that and Navalny saw that footage, I think it really changed the complexion of our relationship. He understood at that moment that we had sort of gone through the fire together, and we were in it. And I think that's really cracked open the access door. And at that point, it was like, okay, whatever we need to do to make this film great. Navalny understood that. He was a very active, willing, enthusiastic documentary participant, documentary subject, and that is. It comes through on screen. That's why the film has this intimate feeling that it does. It's all because of Alexei Navalny.
I don't actually remember that scene. No, I'm kidding, of course. I would say that is, it happens occasionally in certain films. That's one of the great moments of documentary filmmaking. It is jaw-droppingly brilliant and incredibly gratifying and incredibly satisfying and incredibly shocking and just utterly, utterly brilliant. So I can't imagine what it must have felt like as that was going down, I have to say. Yeah. And Christo, from your perspective, that specific scene, could you, I can't imagine what was going through your mind as that was all playing out.
I mean, you have to understand that most of our investigations, we do all of that based purely on data. So we can be theoretically 100% sure of our findings, but that doesn't actually add much of an emotional component to our findings. It doesn't. We're not able to confront the subjects of our investigations because usually they hang up before we even say our name. And here we had something completely different. We had 100% of certainty in the data, but we had suddenly somebody talking. We visualized, we audiolized somebody that we had studied for months, and we knew their prior history for the last 10 years. But here he was talking and admitting to everything that we were sure of suspecting him of, but again, coming from his mouth with the lack of any remorse, it seemed, about what he had been doing. And spoiler alert, trying to poison people and then covering the tracks. That added a completely different complexity and complexion to my investigation. So the whole time, which was much longer than you see in the film, it was a 50-minute call, starting at about 5 a.m, where everybody was underslept and kind of trying to get this over with so we can continue the day of publishing our investigation. You can imagine the whole palette of emotions that I went through. First, it was, well, let's get it over with. Then, wait a second, this guy took the bait and he's talking, but maybe it's a double game where he's playing us, and maybe the doors will be just broken into where we were in this hidden place, and the FSB will come in and kill us all. And then at one point, I started hearing new things from him that we hadn't even discovered. And then I knew, okay, this is for real. This guy really believed Alexei Navalny is his FSB boss or super boss, and he's spilling the beans. And then at one point, it went through just 2 more emotions out of many more that I can go on forever. But I remember then a moment when I started feeling pity for this guy, because I thought, what have we done to him? He'll be probably killed before the end of the day. And then at the end, there was one unexpected emotion of despair, because I thought, okay, this must be the peak of my investigative career. I'll never see anything like this again. And so what do we do? What do I do next? So anyway, this was just a sample of how I felt.
Amazing. Well, as I said, it's stunning and it's beautifully played out in the film. Just a matter of interest, do we know what did happen to that guy?
Well, we did discover that about a year later, he did submit himself to a COVID test, and it was negative. So he's alive, and he didn't have COVID a year ago.
Right, right. And Daniel, how long were you shooting for then? I wonder how does one go about making a film like this? Because presumably it must be very hard to know when the beginning is, but you don't know when the end's going to be, and how you budget for that. And how long were you shooting for? How long were you editing for?
Yeah, well, I think one of the great challenges as we started shooting the film was that we understood we had an enormous time constraint. Navalny announced almost immediately after he woke up from his coma that as soon as he was physically able, he was going back to Russia. His aides were surprised he didn't go back immediately, but he understood that he was going to go back. He informed us of this. We didn't know when. We thought maybe it would be February or March. And so we were all very surprised when he told us at the very beginning of January that he was going back in 2 weeks. And so we had Navalny for about 2 months, door to door, where we could film with him. And the architecture of the story was really packed into those 2 months. We had the backstory of this poisoning and who this guy was, through to his recovery and his decision to go back to Russia. And so from my perspective, it was just a question of capturing every shred and morsel of footage and material that we might need to get from this guy before he is inaccessible to us. We understood that when he went back, something bad would happen. We didn't know exactly what, but we knew he would probably be imprisoned for a very long time. And so it was my responsibility to capture everything we needed. So we shot the film in about 2.5 months, and then we had about, I'm going to say, 9 or 10 months to edit the film. And our two editors, Maya Daisy Hawk and Langdon Page, stepped up and were just extraordinary. And it was this sort of moment of creative collaboration like I've never experienced in my career. And I'm very proud of the film we were able to craft out of that time.
Amazing, 2.5 months, gosh. And were there challenges having a subject who was so media familiar, and did he at any point try and exercise any sort of editorial controls?
Well, yeah, he didn't try and exercise editorial controls, but it's certainly challenging when you're making a film, not just about a politician, but about a politician whose greatest strength is his media savvy. This is a guy whose meat and potatoes is his understanding of YouTube and Instagram, and him participating in a documentary in and of itself is him weaponizing the process. How will this benefit him? How will I benefit him? And that's something that we understood from the very beginning, and it's a conflict that we tried to thread into the film itself. He didn't have implicit editorial control. He wasn't in the editing room with us, obviously, and his staff didn't have any editorial control. But by virtue of being a documentary subject, you can choose what is filmed and what's not. You can tell the cameras to get lost when you want to. Thankfully, we found in Navalny a subject who was very open and never really said no to us. And there was a great deal of trust. And even when we did our interview with him, there was nothing we couldn't ask him about. And that was really an outstanding contribution on his part. Most politicians would say, we can't talk about this or we can't talk about that. One of the challenges of this, John, something that's very bittersweet for all of us, is that Navalny's never seen the film. And that's something that's very sad for me. I would love for him to see the film one day. And I think he'd be proud of it. I'd certainly be curious to get his notes. I'm sure he'd have notes, but that's something I look forward to in the future, is him getting out of prison and being able to see the film with his wife and children.
Yeah. Can I jump in here and give my impression as a sort of fly on the wall of the relationship between Daniel and Alexei on this front, on control? I mean, from the very beginning, Daniel was really outspoken about the fact that Navalny would have no say. And that was a hard pill for Alexei to swallow, given how charismatic and media savvy he is. But Daniel made it very clear from the beginning. And it took a while for Alexei to accept that. He did ultimately, and that's fair. But then there's a little nugget in the film that you will see. It almost looks like an outtake that was added by mistake into the film, but it's really happened. It was a conversation off camera, or so they thought, between Alexei Navalny and Maria Battsek, his chief of investigations, who was very protective and very loyal to him. And it was after a particular nasty interview that Daniel did with him, or a very aggressive one, she thought, and she was asking Alexei off camera, was that hard? I mean, should I try to influence him to be less hard on you? And then Alexei said, let him ask whatever he wants to ask. So that's how it went, essentially. Daniel had full control, and Alexei just succumbed to that.
Yeah, amazing. Christo, I come from a long line of cowards, and so watching this film, I think to myself, and I was thinking as it was going down, you know what's going to happen to you if you go back. And sure enough, he's been in prison ever since he went back. I read that article by his daughter, which was printed recently, I think. I suppose my first question is probably a naive/stupid question is, obviously, to his mind, he's much more effective from within prison than he would have been in exile. Is that really the point?
Well, I did have that conversation both with him and with his wife, with Yulia. And it was clear, it was as if I was asking a stupid question. Of course, he can't pretend to be a candidate for office if he's not part of the milieu of the people, if he doesn't suffer the same consequences as they do for saying what they want to say. So he has to be there with them at the cost of anything, right? So that was a clear statement. I had to accept it. I did ask for a follow-up. I mean, you do realize that he might end up in jail, and it's not going to be for days or weeks, do you? And then Yulia, his wife, said, yeah, absolutely. We expect him to be in jail for years. So what? So, I mean, it's a different breed of thinking about oneself than I have and than you have, I'm sure. So it's hard to comprehend it, but history has been usually changed by people that have that in them.
Right. And I suppose, again, it's an impossible question to answer, but do you think, I mean, is there any sort of realistic possibility that he might be released? I produced the film about Mikhail Khodorkovsky, of course, a very different story and a very different character, but as we all know, he was released for whatever the reasons were. Do you think there's a chance at some point down the road that he may be released, or does it require the removal of Putin for him to have any chance of being released?
Well, my guess is that there's no way that Putin will release him just because he changes his mind or changes the level of his fear of Alexei. But it's wartime. Putin's personal situation is such that he's never been more volatile, or his popularity has never been more volatile than now. Nobody knows if he's going to be removed from, let's say, by the normal side in society, or even by the worst side in society. So everything is up for grabs. But one must also consider that Putin has lost a lot of important to him people to arrests all around the world, spies. Yeah. So one can also imagine that he might ask for those spies back and be willing to give up the people he's incarcerated. So everything is possible, and I would say more possible now during the war than before.
And when does one get to hear from Alexei? Does he have appeals and then he stands up, gets a chance to stand up in court and say anything? Or is he, I mean, according to having read his daughter's article, he appears to be effectively locked up in a metal box most of the time. Does he ever get the chance to be heard?
Well, not anymore. He had a few appeals that he used to the maximum to basically speak through the fourth wall, essentially. He was speaking to the judge, but he was turning to the camera. That was amazing political mastery, what he did there. These speeches were repeated and recited as poems by his followers. And there are millions or tens of millions of them in Russia. But not anymore. I mean, Putin realized that allowing him to speak in any circumstance, even with the literally making the volume of his microphone inaudible, is very dangerous for him. So he's locked up in solitary confinement, and there's no hope for him to actually be able to communicate.
And John, one thing I just want to add to that, it's important that we recognize the reason why Navalny is specifically in solitary confinement. We're talking about a 7 by 8 foot cell without access to his lawyers, without family visitation rights. It's unprecedented in the history of the Russian penal system. And the reason why they have him in such severe conditions is because Navalny is the #1 anti-war campaigner in Russia. What he and his staff are doing, what he's directing them to do from prison, is to launch an all-out information war against Kremlin propaganda. They are continuing to use their investigative mechanisms to have the illicit assets of Russian oligarchs close to Putin seized overseas. And they are even offering to pay the fines of protesters in Russia who are fined for protesting the war. That's why Putin has him in solitary, because he's the #1 anti-war activist in the country right now.
Right. Got it. Listen, last question. Daniel, I know the answer, but tell us a bit about the response to the movie and how gratifying that must be for all of you.
Yeah, the film has been very well received. And I think that part of that has to do with the fact that the film premiered 3 weeks before this war started. And in a way, the film's sort of a precursor to what we're seeing playing out in Ukraine. What we see in this film, what we see depicted in the movie, is this mad tyrant using murder and violence to solve political problems, which we see playing out in a much larger scale across Ukraine. And I think because of the time in history when this film exists, it's resonating with people in a way that is sort of extra powerful. And so for us, that's obviously extraordinary to have your film be so well received. But at the end of the day, John, we very much equivocate the success of the film, the fame and notoriety of the film, with the well-being of Alexei Navalny. We believe that the film is sort of an insurance policy for him. As he is languishing in prison, keeping his name echoing through the global consciousness is something that can keep him safe, dissuade the regime from murdering him. If he is truly the #1 political prisoner on the planet, keeping him in that light, keeping him famous almost, will hopefully dissuade the regime from murdering him. And instead they'll say, let's just let him languish in that little cell. That's certainly our preference. We'd like to get him out one day, but we want to make sure he survives, because I believe his impact on Russian history is unfulfilled. And I think all the accolade and attention the film has received is ultimately very, very good for Navalny and his longevity. And that's what matters most to all of us.
Well, he's a remarkable character, and it's a very definitely remarkable film. Congratulations to you both. Christo, it's a real pleasure to meet you. And Daniel, congrats. Hats off.
Thanks so much, John.